Welcome to Reproductive Justice Now, sponsored by the Philadelphia chapter of the National Organization for Women. Across the nation and here in Pennsylvania, states are limiting a woman's right to an abortion. These attacks on abortion also undermine access to contraception. Chipping away at abortion erodes the same legal rights to the pill, patches, the IUD, and even condoms. I'm Karen Hunt, and I spoke with historian Heather Monroe Prescott, author of The Morning After, The History of Emergency Contraception in the United States. We talk about the historic struggle to control women's fertility and current efforts to roll back women's rights. Thank you for coming.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, let me ask you, what are some of the crazier things that women in history have done for contraception?
What are some of the craziest things that women have done for contraception? Well, the craziest thing I've heard of is crocodile dung, which women in ancient Egypt apparently used. How they discovered that crocodile dung could prevent conception, I don't know, but apparently now we know scientifically that it has something to, interferes with sperm motility by changing the pH of your vagina. So that's the most unusual thing I've heard of.
That's pretty crazy. Yeah. That's pretty wild. But it's basically just been sort of all along in terms of recorded history that women have been trying
to. Yes, for thousands of years and probably longer. Those are just the examples we know of from recorded history from ancient Egypt and beyond. So.
And you were talking about some of the other methods that.
Some of the things that were designed for other purposes, apparently women used for contraception as well. There were devices designed for women. One of the complications of multiple pregnancies and an era, particularly before there was adequate prenatal care, is women's uteruses would collapse and sometimes poke through the cervix or even the vagina. And so there were devices called pessaries designed to lift the uterus back up through the cervix. And those, of course, could function the same way that diaphragms do. And so if you were using one during intercourse, then that could prevent conception as well. So, and then there were, I saw a patent for a device, I'm not sure if it was ever marketed, but for something that's kind of the precursor to the Diva Cup, which was used for during menstruation. This is the era before sanitary napkins and tampons, and so this was a device that would collect your menstrual blood and then you'd empty it out and put it back in. So, and apparently that was used for
sort of got the idea well, that would work. So it seems like women sort of kind of intuitively understood, like
there was certainly Aristotle and probably other ancient scientists knew that there was something that the male contributed during the sexual act and that led to conception. So, but they didn't. This was before microscopes, so they weren't aware that there was something in the semen, that there were sperm, but they knew that there was some kind of agent within the semen that went into the woman's body.
So it's
just a matter of blocking that.
Right. Yes. How has contraception changed in this country over the last, say, 200 years?
The substances that were given to women to quote unquote bring on the menses, we now know have abortifacient properties. And also some of the herbal remedies that were given to women to promote lactation, we now know contain hormones that can suppress menstruation. So there seems to have been some empirical understanding that certain herbs could have these specific effects. But there was, and I think condoms made out of sheep intestines were on the market, I think by the 18th century, but I'm not certain about that. Not widely available, and of course you had to know where to get them and things like that. So, and it looks like that people in early America understood the effect of lactation on preventing pregnancy as well, and that's something that's pretty well established, and as I understand it, used pretty reliably in the developing world as one way to at least reduce.
Have sort of a little bit of time off from worrying about
right, yeah, and you know, in earlier time periods, and really until the pill came on the market, people were satisfied with simply reducing their fertility, not completely preventing pregnancy. So the pill really raised people's expectations about having a foolproof method, whereas when fertility started to decline, in the early 19th century, it's clear that people were satisfied with a combination of methods, probably periodic abstinence, or there are marital advice manuals talking about the various ways, different forms of love.
Right.
So, in euphemistic ways, but people were probably engaging in sexual activities that were not intercourse, and knew that that could prevent pregnancy as well.
Okay, makes sense.
Right.
Well, when was the pill introduced, and what was the reaction? How easy or hard was it to get?
Well, the pill was approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States in 1960, so it just turned 50. And the reaction was kind of all over the place. There was fears that women would become so sexually free within marriage that they would exhaust their husbands. But the pill was really appeared on the market and this is kind of was especially the philosophy of John Rock, who was the physician who helped test the pill, was that the pill was supposed to free married women from repeated pregnancies, to allow them to space their children, to perhaps finish their educations. So it wasn't really intended initially, or at least consciously marketed as something that would liberate single women from having to worry about conception, although that's something that developed later. And in fact, early, when the pill first appeared on the market, several states, including Connecticut, outlawed the sale and distribution of contraceptives entirely. In 1965, there was the Griswold versus Connecticut decision that finally overturned most of those laws, at least in terms of married women, by saying that laws prohibiting contraception interfered with the rights of marital privacy. But they didn't say anything about unmarried women. Now, some states, just basically open the door to anyone, but some states, like Massachusetts, for example, called it a crime against chastity to give contraceptives to unmarried people. So contraceptive salesman Bill Baird was arrested in Boston in 1967, I think, for giving a free sample of contraceptive foam to a unmarried teenager. And so eventually that led to a Supreme Court case that overturned laws restricting contraceptives for unmarried individuals. And that was the year before Roe v. Wade. So it's kind of a gradual process. So when the pill came on the market in 1960, it wasn't available to everyone. And so, there's this myth that the pill caused the sexual revolution. And there's two problems with that. One, first of all, that not everybody could get it, and particularly single women, who are kind of seen as the ones who caused the sexual revolution.
Right.
But also the Kinsey, Alfred Kinsey's report on sexual behavior of the human female, which came out in 1953, indicated that sexual practices were changing long before the pill came on the market. Now, as it turns out, once women of all ages were able to have access to the pill, they were able to stay in college, complete their educations. Married women could have jobs and careers and things like that. So eventually the pill did contribute to a lot of the changes that we see in the late 1960s and early 1970s for women. But it wasn't as revolutionary as people might think, just simply because of the limitations on legal access. And then also, of course, this is an era before Medicaid. So women, low-income women, couldn't get the pill because they couldn't afford it, because they didn't have health insurance, and the Medicaid program was not in place yet. The pill wasn't cheap. They didn't have still not. They didn't have the subsidies, didn't have the federally funded program, the federal funding that Planned Parenthood and other clinics get to take care of low-income women. So there was an economic barrier early on as well.
Okay. It seems to me that, a lot of those barriers are still in place, but I suppose looking at it from the point of view of the 60s and 70s, that there actually has been a pretty good amount of progress.
Yes, I would agree. There definitely has been progress in terms of access, both in terms of providing ways for low-income women to get contraception, but also I think in terms of having clinics in rural areas. I grew up in a rural area in northern New England, and I was fortunate that the closest Planned Parenthood clinic was only a few miles from where I lived, but some people
are just out a lot.
But I still need an automobile to get there, and there was no public transportation to speak of. So people say, well, why is there in Connecticut the highest teen pregnancy rate is in the rural northeastern part of the state, and that's because there's no facility and there's no way to get there, even if there was one. So.
Contraception and access to contraception, played a big part of the women's health movement in the 60s and 70s. Can you sort of, expand on that link?
Yeah, there's two ways in which contraception and the women's health movement went together. The first way is the way that we usually think of it, that is that women were fighting for against law, particularly young single women in college were leading protest efforts and social movement efforts to gain access to reliable contraception. So some students' health services, but in some places students had to fight for it, and it's kind of tied up with this other student protests of the era. Barbara Seaman, who was an investigative reporter for the New York Times and wrote for other journals, wrote a book in 1969 called The Doctor's Case Against the Pill, which exposed the ways in which women had been used as test subjects without the full understanding of what they were getting into, and also alleged that pill manufacturers were not being completely honest with consumers about, just not disclosing information that consumers really needed. Or even to physicians about the potential dangers of taking the pill.
So when some of these side effects became known, how did that affect the efficacy of the pill? I mean, did the pill itself change?
Well, as you might imagine, women became scared and stopped taking the pill and switched to other methods of contraception. But it also led to a consumer movement led by the forerunner of the National Women's Health Network and the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, which put out Our Bodies Ourselves, to make sure that drugs that are put on the market are adequately tested, that consumers are fully informed of all the side effects. And my students laugh at all of the direct-to-consumer marketing we have on television today. For example, the Yaz commercial, which goes through all, shows these women in a bar and talking about contraception in a very lighthearted Sex and the City kind of way. And then one of them starts to spout out all of the side effects. and that's because of the direct consumer deal that pharmaceutical manufacturers got. Prior to the 1970s, manufacturers didn't have to disclose that even in written form to patients. They had to do that with physicians and then rely on physicians to transmit that information to the patient. And so what the women's health movement did is to attack and overturn that paternalism and make sure that women had accurate and reliable health information. So Our Bodies Ourselves is kind of the model of that.
When was contraception separated out from abortion?
Well, one of the things that is kind of interesting in Planned Parenthood's history is that their emphasis really for many years was on birth control. And when Bill Baird, who was kind of one of these very militant birth control activists, started saying, well, we should be talking about birth control and abortion, Planned Parenthood was like, no, we can't do that.
That's funny.
So for many years, birth control organizations separated out birth control and abortion. And some people who supported contraception were opposed morally to abortion as well. So it's really only recently that I think partly because the court cases that were the precursor to Roe v. Wade kind of made birth control and abortion part of a continuum of women's rights to privacy and so forth. So I think that's a very recent development that the two have been put together.
Well, I think very often that people would rather they be separate. I mean,
so.
Politically, it's easier.
Well, there's surveys that show that that Catholic women Catholic and evangelical Protestant women use contraception, including the pill, as much, if not more, than women who have more liberal faith traditions or no faith traditions. So,
I saw that. Yeah.
Whereas if you polled the same people about abortion, the picture would be much different. So, so I think making people, particularly young women, understand that the attacks on abortion are undercutting the same legal principles that were used to establish women's rights to contraception is important, because what conservative groups are doing is just kind of, well, first we're going to chip away at abortion, and then we'll start chipping away at contraception, and pretty soon, I don't think we'll ever go back to the pre-Griswold v. Connecticut days. Even Samuel Alito during his and Chief Justice Roberts said during their confirmation hearings that Griswold was settled law, but you can't say it. I'm certainly not going to say the same thing about Roe, or maybe even Baird versus Eisenstadt, which is the decision that removed barriers to unmarried women. So
it's staggering.
Yes, it is.
It's think
very
that
staggering.
That could
it's
be
very frightening. People I talked to who lived through the 1960s and saw women gaining access and fought for, and some of them were women who were students and then became healthcare professionals, say the last decade and a half or so has just been a step backwards. I mean, the Bush era in particular just really, and a lot of us thought when President Obama got elected that things would change, but it seems to be getting worse.
I know. That's especially
right.
frightening.
Right.
Well, let's. What is the morning after pill?
The morning after pill is actually, it's a colloquialism. Technically, you can take emergency contraception, Plan B, and Ellaone, and various other products. Plan B, I think, is effective up to 72 hours after unprotected intercourse, and Ellaone, the one that was just approved by FDA last summer, is effective up to 5 days. So, but the morning after pill is catchier, and that's something that a phrase that got coined very early on when the first pill was morning after, so emergency contraceptive was introduced in the late 1960s. Jane Brody in the New York Times issued a story in, I think it was 1967 as well, 66 or 67. So word of the morning after pill spread like wildfire through the popular press as well. So
that's so weird to me, because I really it's only been on my radar for, the
20
last
years. Yeah, 20 years. Same here. When I first started hearing about emergency contraception in the early 1990s, when Reproductive Health Technologies Project, as it turns out, and various physicians and population experts were starting a promotion effort to let people know that you could use certain oral contraceptive pills as an emergency contraception.
Well, why was it so hard to get FDA approval?
Well, this is a very long story, and I spend a couple of chapters in my book teasing this story. But basically, if you give a very high dose of estrogen, what Pincus and other scientists discovered, if you give a very high dose of estrogen to women after unprotected intercourse, it speeds the transport of the egg through the fallopian tubes, the uterus, and so the egg is, if a woman has ovulated, the egg will be expelled before it's fertilized, and so if the dosage of DES, diethylstilbestrol, that was given as an emergency contraceptive was enormous, whereas the dose that was given to prevent miscarriage was much lower and over a continual period of time. Anyways, it was discovered in the early 1970s that the daughters of women who had taken DES during pregnancy had developed a rare form of vaginal cancer, and so students at the University of Michigan formed a group called Advocates for Medical Information, and broke the story that diethylstilbestrol was being used as a morning after pill in the Student Health Center, and that reached the national press, and Ralph Nader's health research group reported it, and so that led to a whole series of Senate hearings about diethylstilbestrol, and not just as a morning after pill, but during pregnancy, and why was this drug approved, and so on and so forth. So there's a longer regulatory history involving drug safety. That's, again, part of that whole women's health movement I was talking about earlier. So the more recent history has to do with pharmaceutical companies being so gun shy from lawsuits and Senate hearings and boycotts that they don't want to invest into developing an emergency contraceptive product. The FDA was begging companies to submit a new drug application. And in 1997, FDA took the very unusual step of publishing the USP regimen in the Federal Register without any drug company coming forward to submit a new drug application.
Wow.
That is really very, very unusual for FDA to do. And one official at FDA said, well, we're kind of in a catch-22 situation. We, as the FDA, cannot create a product, and but we also can't regulate how physicians use things off-label. So putting this article in the Federal Register was FDA's way of getting information out. Invitations to various contraceptive manufacturers, and finally this guy in New Jersey, Roderick McKenzie, he basically started a company so that he could create Prevent. The sole purpose was to make this product, get it approved by FDA. So Plan B, so the Susan Camp, who, but again, it's another case of somebody creating a company solely for the sole purpose of creating a product because no one else would do it.
That sounds like
right.
a good thing.
Yes,
you know?
it is. I mean, there was no profit, pretty much no profit in it at all. Outside investors, because again, no one will no one will touch it. But it was, Roderick McKenzie and Sharon Camp did it because they wanted to make this product available. So a lot of it had to, we're more familiar with the more recent story of Plan B, trying to get over the counter, and the villains in that are the, George Bush and FDA commissioner who turned down the Reproductive Health Advisory Committee's recommendation, and so on and so forth. But, there's other, the pharmaceutical industry, first of all, not seeing any profit in it, not seeing any profit in it. There's huge profit in regular oral contraceptives because millions of women take it every day for 10, 20, even 30 years. Whereas an emergency contraceptive, if you...
So once and done.
Yeah. I mean, some people, you hope people don't take it as a regular form of birth control.
Why is it still hard to obtain the morning after? Or I should say Plan B, really, is that...
So part of it is an awareness thing. Also, one of the ironies of over-the-counter access is that the cost has gone up. And because it's an over-the-counter drug, not a prescription drug, it's not covered by health insurance. So now, because I guess there's a generic version of Plan B, the cost has gone down. So, so part of it's economics, part of it's, I think, it varies from state to state, but, there's the whole pharmacist refusal thing. Some places probably don't carry it. It's not technically available over the counter. You have to go to the pharmacist and get it from behind the counter and show that you're 18 or over, have an ID to show if you're 18 or over. So the fact that you have to go up and ask for it is probably a barrier as well, and show, announce to everybody. Although why that is any different than grabbing it off the shelf and going to the counter, I don't know, but ask for it.
Well, I think one definitely having to ask for it and then having it be a possibility that you'll be refused.
Right. Yeah.
Is
a barrier, right?
Definitely a barrier.
But the articles that I've read is that the expectation that making Plan B available over the counter would reduce unintended pregnancies. It turns out that hasn't been the case. And
really?
So population experts are kind of trying to figure that out. And
I'm surprised too.
I was very surprised, which I guess shows the limits of technology, that it's all very well and good to have the technology, but if you don't have a way to put it in people's hands, and can overcome, all sorts of barriers, whether they're economic, moral, social, whatever, then, there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed.
What is the medical difference between abortion and contraception?
Well, one of the things that conservatives allege, which is completely erroneous, is that emergency contraception is the same as RU-486 or mifepristone, as its scientific name is. Mifepristone was developed in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and approved as a form of medical abortion. And I forget what the time frame is, but it's sometime during the first trimester. Emergency contraception is not abortion. It prevents ovulation or accelerates the egg through the reproductive tract. So it's not an abortion drug, but it's often conflated with mifepristone. And in fact, you can use mifepristone as an emergency contraceptive as well as an abortion drug. So if you're talking about surgical abortion, then there's obvious differences, right? And I think partly, as Gail Collins and other commentators have said, is that religious conservatives don't want to stop with abortion. They want to keep going, and then what they're going to do is they're going to chip away at abortion rights, and then they're going to start chipping away at. I don't think we're going to go back to pre-Griswold, but I think what will happen is that first they'll chip away at economic access, by getting rid of federal funds to Planned Parenthood and other agencies of that sort, and then they'll undo health reform, and then they'll have parental consent laws for getting contraception like they do for abortion. So they'll just chip away at the edges, and before you know it, you're a 20-year-old who can't get contraception because you can't afford it, or you have to get, or you're a 17-year-old and you have to get your mother's permission or something like that.
Do you see any parallels in what's happening now at the state and the national level to any other points in history?
People are saying what will happen if Roe v. Wade gets overturned. But what will happen is that it will be left up to the individual states to determine abortion law, and that's kind of another thrust of the Tea Party in particular, is that we don't want so much federal government. We want to reduce the size of federal government and leave it up to the states to determine X, Y, and Z. So a state like Connecticut, you'll probably have decent access, but Mississippi, South Dakota, places that are already passing laws that they know are going to be challenged on their constitutionality and previous court decisions, and to see if the U.S. Supreme Court will actually do it and go and reverse Roe v. Wade. So,
do you see that affecting? Well, I guess you really already answered that question, because if the agenda is to eventually chip away at contraception, then once there is no Roe v. Wade, that will be the next.
Right.
That will be the next.
Well, it remains to be seen. I mean, the polls indicating that women, the findings of Catholic women are no surprise, because the people who are outside of even nuns, are more progressives than you would think.
Well, I know.
Now, priests are another story, and of course, the Pope and bishops and things like that. But the fact that congregants are completely
like 98%
disregarding official church doctrine on contraception is no surprise to me. But conservative Protestants was actually very surprising. So I think that I try to be optimistic about some things. I mean, things are not as bad as they were even 50 years ago, in terms of partly because social views have changed so much, and we have a whole generation that's grown up assuming that they can get contraception if they need it. They've faced economic barriers of one sort or another, or social awkwardness, but the notion that the state can tell you that you can't have contraception, I don't think we'll ever go back to that.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
A lot of good insights.
Good.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
And we look forward to seeing your book too.
Great.
I hope you enjoyed our program today. Philadelphia Now is pleased to sponsor this series, Reproductive Justice Now, which explores the political, social, and medical aspects of reproduction and a woman's right to control her own fertility. For Philadelphia Now, I'm Karen Hunt. Thank you for watching.